Hey guys, it's Curtis. I'm doing tonight's video blog for Worship Wednesdays. The message I wanted to do tonight is targeted specifically towards the DiversAble allies out there in our audience. I wanted to highlight the story of Jesus healing the paralytic. That story happens to be in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'm going to be reading it out of Luke. Luke tends to be one of my 2 favorite Gospels. Luke was a doctor. He was known to heavily and deeply research and verify the stories that he wrote down. So he was a very intelligent man, and it's one of my favorite things about his Gospel and his story. Anyway, I'm going to start reading Luke chapter 5, verse 17. One day, as he was teaching, he being Jesus, by the way, Pharisees and teachers of the law, who had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem, were sitting there, and the power of the Lord was present for him to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralytic on a mat, and tried to take him into the house and lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." Immediately he stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on, and went home praising God. Everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today." So that's the story. One of the first things that pops out at me is the translators, the guys who translated the original Greek or Aramaic into English. They had no sense of people first terminology. They call this guy a paralytic instead of a man with paralysis. And while it's understandable, and it kind of has become iconic in Christian culture because of that, I guess there really is just something wrong with defining a person by their disability, as opposed to defining them as a person first who happens to have a disability. The second thing that jumps out at me is this guy's friends. They were so moved by their love for this man. Even though there's no stories about what he may have done for them or the kinds of things he talked to them about, something about this guy was so lovable and so moving and so inspiring that they not only went out of their way to try and get him to Jesus, who they believed could heal him. Most people would have probably brought the guy to the house, sure, especially if they loved the person. But they just couldn't get in because the crowds were too crazy. A lot of people would have given up at that point. But these guys, seriously, they stepped back and thought outside the box. And they broke some property and lowered the guy right in front of Jesus, right in front of everybody. Had no problem making a scene because they loved this man that much. And their faith that Jesus could heal him was so impressive to Jesus. He not only healed the guy, but he forgave his sins. So that to me really struck a chord in me, and I'll tell you why. I was telling someone a long time ago, a couple years ago now, that this is after my experience working with Amanda at Children's Bible Fellowship. They were Amanda basically did a lot of work with people with both mental and emotional disabilities as well as physical disabilities. And I kind of differentiated the kinds of things that someone learned by ministering to people with both kinds of disabilities. I found that people with mental or intellectual disabilities or emotional disabilities, they tend to teach someone through experience, of course, patience, kindness, gentleness, long-suffering. All these things are attributes that are valuable and are part of love. It's these attributes, these traits are things that I think, and all of us should aspire to take with us into eternity. And I think that's part of the point, part of the reason why God allows things like those kinds of disabilities in people, is that they inspire a certain kind of love, devotion, loyalty, protectiveness for people who can't defend themselves, who can't stand up for themselves maybe, or act on their own behalf. And then I also went into people with physical disabilities, like my wife, like my wife, and some of her friends, some of the smartest people I know, have ever met. My wife is a brilliant woman, and from the very beginning, since we even started dating, let alone, once we got married and everything, it wasn't that we pretended her disability didn't exist, but we also didn't make it the defining attribute of our relationship either. We decided to have a relationship and just accept the fact that she had a disability and just take that into our everyday life together. But something I tell my wife all the time, tell my wife and tell other people about my wife, probably even more frequently, is that you can't help but once you get to know her, to love her. I mean, she's one of the most lovable people I've ever known. Everybody I've ever known who's ever really had contact with her and gotten to know her really fell in love with her. And she's not the only one who's done that, who's inspired that kind of a reaction. And I really feel like that spirit, that ability to learn how to administer to someone and love someone in that way is something that God also uses their disability for. And I feel like knowing someone, having someone with disabilities in your life, can teach a DiversAble Ally advocacy, standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. I mean, it is most primarily, I guess, aimed for people with intellectual or emotional disabilities, people who aren't necessarily capable of clear communication, or interaction. So just advocating and standing up for them when they can't stand up for themselves. Learning how to take care of them in a way that takes them into account. And social justice, I think, is something that people with physical disabilities teach the rest of us. It's a respect thing and an acknowledgement of their spirit and of their personhood in a lot of ways, and their reflection of God's image. As God has made all of us in His image, they're no exception. And in a big way, once I started dating Amanda, for example, I started looking at buildings like I've never looked at buildings before. How wide are the hallways? How wide are the doorways? Are there stairs? Are there elevators? Are there ramps? Is there a space where she can sit? Movie theaters. was the space for wheelchairs all the way in the back, all the way in the front, somewhere in the middle? Were there chairs next to them? Or were they just empty spaces where you were meant to just kind of abandon them and go find a seat for yourself? I gained eyes, and I learned to look at the world in a way that I think is more respectful of people with disabilities who can't really help their disabilities and who don't deserve to be mistreated or left out or neglected because of them. So that's where I'm going to end at. I would love to hear your feedback, your comments, your questions. Just put them in the comment section down below. We would love to get discussion started. If there are any topics you really want to cover or you really have questions about for future Worship Wednesdays, we would love to hear those. We can always use more ideas. And hopefully in the future, you guys won't just be stuck with me, although I don't mind doing this. We're hoping to showcase some pastors and some people who have a lot more experience at this whole preaching thing and teaching thing. So come back, and thanks for watching.